Hey, what's up? Carl Reese here. Bible prophecy, why we watch and pray. And today I'm really excited about the topic because it's very dear to my heart. God has been giving me revelation over many years because I've noticed this pattern in the story of Joseph and how closely it maps to the life of Jesus. And it just convinces me that Joseph is absolutely a type of Jesus Christ. And that the things that happened in his life completely paralleled the things that would happen in Jesus' life. And all the way up through the fact that Jesus will have a second coming and will be revealed to the nation of Israel at the very end. And so that, if we follow the story of Joseph, we can actually place where we are today in the biblical narrative, in the biblical timeline. And so that makes Joseph's life not only an incredible foretelling of the first coming of Jesus, but absolutely a foretelling of his second coming. That makes him a very interesting character in the Bible. But before I get going, I'd like to actually go over my Bible prophecy ground rules. As you guys know, I always try to stick closely to the Bible. I will let the Bible interpret itself. The interpretation must remain consistent throughout all the Bible. I'm not going to try to add my own understanding to it. In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, I'll let every word be established. If it's not interpreted, then I will take it literally. And finally, in the areas where I just don't know, I'm going to be happy to tell you, I just don't know. And then, of course, today, there will be plenty of things where I don't know exactly. I mean, because this is very interpretive stuff, and you're going to be, I invite you to even challenge these things. I just think that there are so many coincidences that it's really, really hard to not see how God has used Joseph in the way that I'm about to describe. So let me just dive right in. Because first of all, for anyone who doesn't know who Joseph is, right? Joseph, he was one of the children of the patriarch named Jacob, who also is known as Israel in the Bible. This is where the nation of Israel gets its name, from this character in the Bible. Israel is the grandson of Abraham. Abraham is the one who God gave the promise to, that in his seed he would bring forth the Messiah, and that through that Messiah he would bless many nations in all the earth, right? Abraham begat Isaac by a promise from God, and Isaac begat Jacob by a promise from God. They were both second-born children of their father. And I gave a whole discussion on the significance of the second in the Bible. So I'll refer you back to that discussion, and I'll pick it up here. So Jacob, who is Israel, had 10 sons, and then his 11th son was by his chosen or his favorite wife, her name was Rachel. The other 10 were born by her sister Leah, and then their handmaids Bilhah and Zilpah. But Rachel was the one that Jacob worked for 14 years to have her. He was the one that he really loved. And she could not have any kids. And finally, when she had a child, her child was this Joseph. Right? So he was the 11th child. So as the story goes, Joseph, well, first of all, before I even go, I want to give a little background on Hebrew numerology, because numbers in the Bible are very, very significant. Very significant. They create themes. Wherever you see certain numbers, they almost always contribute to the exact same theme wherever you see them. And so if it says that there are 3 of something, then you can know that there's some sort of number, is a number of completeness and even divinity, because it represents the 3-part triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who are complete, who are also, they come together to make one, right? And so we see these 3s all throughout nature, right? In water we have steam, liquid, and ice. In an egg we have a shell, a yolk, and a white. And these 3s end up in nature because they reflect the very image of God. God said that we can know him by the things that he created. And so he filters these 3s all throughout nature, in science, in medicine, in us, we're even three parts, right? Body, soul, and spirit. We're his creation, right? So that number 3, when you see it, it should just trigger in your mind. Oh, there's that 3 again, right? And they're all over the place. Well, numbers have very significant. There's lots of numbers in the Bible, but the first 12, they all have pretty significant meanings. I'm just going to bounce through them very quickly. The number 1 is the number of unity or primacy, right? It represents the oneness of the Godhead, the unity, that they are one in every way. That one is not above the other. They share in everything. They agree on everything. They are all individually the truth and together the truth, right? 2 really represents the number of the Son, right? He's the second member of the Godhead. And also of the union, right? There are all these unions that come up in 2s, right? The marriage relationship is a union, for example. The union of Jesus with his church is a union. It also represents division, right? How God will separate the goats from the lambs, right? The righteous from the unrighteous, truth from falsehood. There's these duels, right? And so in the Bible, that's often represented that way. Like I mentioned already, number 3 is the completeness of resurrection or the Godhead. Also the priesthood, right? Because the third son of Israel is Levi, through whom the priestly line came, right? So let's remember that guy. That's probably pretty. 4, the number of earthly kingship and authority. Also the number of rest. We remember that the 4th commandment was the commandment to keep the Sabbath and to keep it holy. It represents God's effort or God's doing. It's also representative of the person of Jesus, right? He was the Word of God, or the second member of the Godhead from eternity. That's his spiritual existence from eternity. He was there in the beginning when all the creation was being made. His spirit was part of God's spirit, was there in the beginning. But when he came to the earth, he put away or set aside his divine capability and his divinity. And he took on flesh and became a real human so that he could live just like us for the purpose of saving us. And so that number 4, which is the 4th son, Judah, the line through which Jesus ultimately would come, the 4th son of Israel, is also representative of godly humanity in the person of Jesus Christ, right? 5 is clearly the number of grace, God's goodness, his favor toward mankind. Grace, grace, grace. 6 is the number of man and human effort as opposed to God effort, the number 4, right? Human effort is when we were the 6th of, created on the 6th day, God's creation, mankind, and so that's why 6 is the number of man, and we were the only being created on that day, I believe. But we were definitely his penultimate creation on the 6th day, right before he rested. And you remember in Revelation we had the number 666. Satan used that because it's the number of man. He wants us to be focused down here instead of up there, right? That's what he's trying to say. Man can be God on his own 3 times over. It's a complete one, right? So that's where that number comes from. 7 is the perfect number of completeness. It represents completeness, perfection, right? At number 7, right? And you'll see 7 all the time in the Bible. I mean, it's probably the most repeated number all over. There's 7 years at the end that the Bible talks about. There's 7 days in the week. 7, 7, 7. And that prophecy by Daniel had 70 weeks, right? That were there. So, number 8 is new beginnings because it comes right after the number 7, right? And you have new beginnings, right? Slaves in the Old Testament were able to be kept only for 7 years, and on the 8th year, you were supposed to let them free, right? Set them free. It was their new beginning, right? And so it's a number of new beginning or a new order in creation, right? 9, there's 9 fruit of the Spirit. Excuse me. Yes, dear?
It's the dog.
Okay.
It's in there.
Okay, can you shut the door? The dog's in here, it's okay.
Hey, people.
My wife says, hey, people. No problem. She's allowed to come in here. It's her house. So, So, and then number 10 is the number of the law or testimony, right? There's 10 commandments, right? 10 commandments. It's the number of the law, Moses' law. We remember that. Number 11 is sort of the judge or judgment. Interesting. And also can indicate in some places disorder, sin, or chaos. Finally, the number 12 is the number of God's divine power and authority, and also the number of perfect government. We see 12. He had 12 tribes in Israel, 12 sons of Israel. He also had 12 apostles, right? And there's 144,000 Jews in the end that he seals. 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? The number of perfect government, right? So I wanted to get that background because you can actually, when you see these numbers show up in the story of Joseph, it's significant when you try to take a prophetic extension of that into today's day and age, right? So first of all, Joseph, he was basically God's favorite. The characters, and I'll tell you kind of who they represent as we go, right? The mapping, if you will, into Jesus' time. Israel, meaning Joseph's father, represented God the Father, right? Or the spiritual head of mankind and of the creation of mankind. Joseph, of course, represents Jesus, and his life almost maps Jesus' life to the T. And that's why we can use his life to predict things that are happening today. The 10 brothers, remember there's 10 of them, right? The 10 brothers represent the law. They represent Israel. At one point, Israel was 12 sons, right? And Israel was divided after Solomon's reign. 10 sons moved to the northern kingdom, if you will, and they took on the name Israel. And 2, Judah and Benjamin, occupied the southern portion of Israel, and they were known simply as Judah. Today, you can see those as the area of Judea in Israel, which is the West Bank occupied by the Palestinians, but that's where Judea got its name. Judea from the tribe of Judah. So it was Judah and Benjamin, and let's remember that. Judah and Benjamin, Judah and Benjamin. Very interesting that those two were together, and the other 10 formed up Israel, if you will, later on in the north, right? So, Potiphar, and we'll get to those in just a second. So let's bounce through the story of Joseph. And then as I go through, I'm going to show you the corollary, if you will, to Jesus' life, right? Let's start with Genesis in the 37th chapter. We see the story. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph was 17 years old at the time, feeding the flocks with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report to his father about the brothers. So the brothers didn't like the fact that Joseph was kind of tattling on them. Brought a bad report of them. Now Israel, the father, loved Joseph more than all the children. Now how God the Father loves his son Jesus more than all, right? Because he was the son of his old age. And he also made him a tunic of many colors. Now he didn't give all of his sons this beautiful coat. Only Joseph. So he was showing this favoritism to Joseph, right? He was his favorite. Now, the brothers who saw this, they loved him more than all. The father loved him more than the brothers. They hated him, right? And could not even speak peaceably with him. So now we have the 10 who represent the Jews, right? It represents the nation of Israel. Remember that representation. They hate Joseph, who's represented by Jesus, right? We go on, right? And now Joseph dreams, and he had this dream, and Joseph was a dreamer, right? God spoke to him in dreams very often and very significantly. And he dreamed, and he said, please hear the dream that I dreamed. They were there we were, binding sheaves in the field. And behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed, your sheaves, talking to his 10 brothers, stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers hated him more for his dreams, right? Are you telling me that you're going to reign over us? And they were indignant. How could this little young whippersnapper say that he's having dreams that one day he's going to rule over us? Bounce forward. The Messiah, when he came, what did he do? surely he rules and reigns over the whole earth, not only Israel, but also the Gentiles as well. Right? That was the prophecy that he had, that he would rule. And then he went on to say, he had a second dream, and still this other dream, he told his brothers, he said, look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. Okay? So now he's saying, now all the brothers, represented by Israel, and included Benjamin, right? And included Benjamin, because there was 11, bowed down to me, along with the sun and the moon, and we see a little bit later that basically represented the father and his wife. Now, let's read that. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him, saying, now Israel rebuked Joseph, saying, what is this dream you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? Well, indeed, one day in the future, all will bow before Jesus Christ. Every knee, it says, shall bow. And I would not be surprised if God the Father, in all of his humility, also bowed his head to the Son. Wouldn't shock me in the slightest. Right? And who is the wife here? I believe the wife represents bride. Right? Who is presented, the bride being the church, and we also will all bow. So you have the Jews represented by the 11, the bride represented by the church, and the Father. That means all the hosts will be bowing to the Son one day. Right? Totally imagery pointing at the coming Messiah, Jesus, right? And so we bounce forward, and it says that his brothers envied him, but the father kept the matter in his mind, in his heart, right? The father's like, it's an odd saying, but I'm not going to necessarily just write that guy off. It sounds like it could be from God, right? So then his brothers ultimately go, and I'll just fast forward. They end up saying, Joseph ends up going and finding the brothers out in the field doing their work, shepherding and whatnot. And then they see Joseph coming. And so they quickly devise this scheme. They say, man, let's take this dude and just kill him. Right? So they devise this thing. And basically Joseph comes and they grab Joseph when he had found them, because he was looking for them. Say, look at this one. Look, this dreamer is coming. Come, now let us kill him and cast him into some pit where we shall say some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will come of his dreams. Now let's look at the imagery here, right? They basically take him. Remember, this is the Jews, represented by the 10. Because Benjamin is not there. Because Benjamin is very young at this point. He's younger than even Joseph. It's the 10, right? Grab Joseph, throw him into a pit, create a lie saying a beast has taken him. What does the beast represent? Satan, right? The Antichrist, anti-Messiah. This is the beast we talked about all those times. So they're going to say a beast came and tore him up. So in a figure, they're essentially throwing him into the grave, into a pit. Just as Jesus was killed and thrown into a pit where the beasts were allowed to devour him. Right? So they're creating the imagery. And who did the throwing? It was the Jews. In Jesus' time, who was it that said, crucify him, crucify him? We don't want another. We want him dead. Right? They set him up to be crucified. They cast him into the pit. It's the same way they turned him over to the Romans to actually kill him. We will see that that's just what they did. They throw him in the pit. The imagery is that he is dead to them at this moment. Now, a little while later, basically Reuben, the firstborn, the oldest, basically is like, man, this is not right. And so he stepped away for a minute, intending that a little while later he was going to come and fish the boy out and take him back and deliver him back to his father. But while he was away, as time would have it, some Midianite traders, these were of the Ishmaelites, the other son of Abraham, Gentiles, because they were not of the line of Isaac, came by on their way to Egypt. And so they craft this, rather than us kill him, let's hand him to the Gentiles to do the job. And so they sold him to the Gentiles, who then took him down to Egypt, pulled him from the pit, gave him to the Gentiles, and then acted as if he was dead. And in fact, the story they crafted to tell their father was they took and they killed some goats, dipped the coat of many colors, which was representing the priesthood of Jesus, dipped it in blood, right, representing the fact that he was torn apart by these beasts and he was killed, and then took that back to God the Father, or to the Father Israel, who was representing God the Father, and represented that he was dead. Right? As far as they were concerned, he's dead. Right? Sent him, and in fact, they sent him away to the Gentiles to do the killing. Now, we're going to fast forward to Jesus' time. Of course, Jesus was handed by the Jews, who first rejected him and said, crucify him, crucify him. But they wouldn't do the crucifying. What did they do? They handed him to the Romans to do the crucifying. And it was the Romans who actually took him to the cross and nailed him to the cross. And when he died, effectively he went out of the sight of everyone, both Jews and Gentiles. At that point, we have to look in the Bible to find out what he was doing, because he was gone from the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. What was he doing during that time? Okay? So now take Joseph. Boom. He's now on a caravan heading toward Egypt. What does Egypt represent? Well, of course, Egypt represents the land of bondage, basically. Right? He's being taken down there as a slave. And this is the time, remember, that is represented by Jesus being under the earth or under the ground, basically in hell, under captivity of Satan and his representatives. Because during this time, he is paying the price for our sins. He is actually going to the place that we were supposed to go. We killed him, and since he didn't die for his own sins, Jesus actually went to hell because he went for our sins. That's where sin takes you. It separates you from the Father, even as Joseph was separated from his father. Right? Thrown to the wild beasts, or Satan, and now he's down in hell with Satan's cohorts, or his representatives. So let's see where he lands first of all, right? He gets down, and there's a little interlude in between this story to talk about the story of. They talk about the story of Judah and Tamar, which I'm going to come back to the story of Judah and Tamar, but because I think it's extremely significant, and we will learn some things about Judah also later on. Right? Remember, I said that Judah was the particular son of Israel through whom the kingship, or the kingly line, he was the 4th son of Israel, and he was the one through whom the Messiah ultimately was to be born. Of the 12, the Messiah came out of Judah, right? He came out of Judah. And so we got to remember that as we see Judah in the things that Judah does, right, in the story of Joseph, right? So that interlude about Judah is pretty significant. It basically tells about his story with Tamar and this harlot and so forth and so on, and how he ends up having 2 sons, and that those sons end up representing the Messiah also, right? But I want to come back to that story because I do think it's significant, but I want to stick with Joseph for right now. And so we find out that Joseph lands in Egypt now, and he is sold by these Midianite traders to one of the kings of Pharaoh's army, or one of his chief captains, or the captain of his guard, it says. His name is Potiphar. Now, what does Potiphar represent? Potiphar represents one of Satan's demons, right? He is the slave master, if you will, but he represents the temptation part. He couldn't get Jesus on the earth, so that temptation came on Jesus. And so Jesus, while he's in hell, has to overcome the temptation presented by Satan. And it's represented by Potiphar. Now the temptation, also Potiphar's house represents Sodom. Right? So there's both Sodom and Egypt And we will see these names and these terminologies. We remember the two witnesses talking about Jerusalem as Sodom and Egypt. And remember, where Jesus was crucified was in Jerusalem. And he went beneath the earth to Sodom and Egypt. Sodom is represented by Potiphar's house. And we'll see in a second, Egypt's represented by the jail. So now he's amongst these Gentiles, but really these Gentiles are actually representing what's going on in the heart of the earth while Jesus has been, quote, killed, while Joseph has been, quote, killed from the Jews, right? And from the Midianite traders of the Gentiles. He's in the earth in Potiphar's house. And what happens to him there, right? In Potiphar's house, he immediately ascends to become, because God has not left him for 1 second. He's still there, blessing him even in hell, even in bondage. God is still blessing Joseph, even as he blessed Jesus there. And he immediately ascends to be the chief captain of Potiphar's house. He's like the guy who Potiphar puts all of his trust. He gives him control over his entire house, over his money, over the servants, over everything. Joseph is basically running the place. He quickly ascends from being a bought slave to a slave who has his control over all the books and heavily trusted by this chief demon, if you will, named Potiphar. But Potiphar has a wife. The one thing Potiphar doesn't give to Joseph is his wife. And now the wife, who's the one who represents Sodom, the one who represents sexual impurity to the max, she starts putting the moves on Joseph and wants Joseph to sleep with her. And so she starts coming on to him, asking him, come, lie with me. And she's constantly trying to tempt him. And Joseph is like, I can't do this thing. It's like, your husband, my master, he has put me in charge over everything. And the only thing he's held for me is you. Far be it for me to ever commit such a sin against him or my God. And so Joseph shows, actually the story, let me finish the story here. Finally, Potiphar's wife, who's a Jezebel, right, representing Sodom, finally corners Joseph in her bedroom. Lie with me. And Joseph's like, no. And he does what the Bible says we should all do when tempted with sexual immorality. It says to flee. Just get on your horse and just run out of the place. And so he runs, and as he's running, the woman snatches his coat and rips it off of him, and then he takes off without it. Right? And she is pissed off that he would reject her that way. And so when the husband comes back, Potiphar, she makes up this story to say that Joseph came in the room and tried to rape her. And here, see, I even got his coat, part of his coat. I had to rip the thing to get him off me, blah, blah, blah. And she concocts this whole lie about what happened. Potiphar believes her because, of course, he's a demon. And throws Joseph in prison. So he goes from being the height right down to being the bottom again. Only now he gets transferred to prison. Right? Now, who is in prison? Right? Prison sounds kind of like paradise, doesn't it? Paradise, the holding place for the captives in the earth, waiting for the Messiah to come to set them free. Those who had died before the Messiah came, who had died in righteousness, if you will, were cast into some sort of holding place until the time that Jesus would come, pay the price for the sins of both those who lived before, as well as anyone who would live after. Prison. Paradise. And so now Joseph is cast into this prison. Now the Bible says in Galatians, I believe it's in 1 Peter 3:19, that Jesus went, when he was crucified, to minister to the prisoners in the earth. Right? He ministered to prisoners when he was beneath the earth. The Bible actually says that. And we see Joseph going into the prison, and he very quickly he becomes the chief prisoner. Right? What does the Bible say? He's thrown in prison, and it says, and the keeper of the prison committed... So Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison. And notice it was the king's prisoners. They call Pharaoh the king, right? So Pharaoh represents the king of the earth, which was also a type of God the Father, because God is really the king of everything. But really, he was the appointed highest ruling person, because Egypt at that time ruled over the whole earth. Egypt was the ruling kingdom of the time, right? And so Pharaoh was the chief ruler of everybody, right? There's no one that is on the earth that rules that God does not appoint. Not one. He appointed Pharaoh. He gave him his authority. He worked at the pleasure of God the Father on the earth. And he is a king. Remember that. He's a king. And so Joseph, he says, Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So God's prisoners. This means that there were the righteous in this prison, right? And unrighteous probably. But even as Jesus in his day went into hell, the prison of hell, to minister to people the gospel of salvation, so that people could hear the gospel who had lived before he came on the earth. And that's how the salvation came to the people who had lived prior to Jesus' coming. Is that when he went down for those 3 days, he went and ministered to the prisoners, the king's prisoners, in hell or paradise, or wherever this holding place is. That's something that I'm not fully clear about. I just know there's a place that's not here and that's not heaven, right? Some place that's there. And I call it paradise, but I don't quote me on that. I'm not going to say that as a doctrine, but I believe that they're related in somehow. And it says, the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. And so it says that God, actually before that, it says, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. And he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So he had given him favor with Potiphar. Now he gives him favor with the keeper of this prison. Right? And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners. Here you go. Here's all the prisoners. Do with them as you will. Right? And whatever they did there, it was Joseph's doing. Okay? And so suddenly we see an image of what Jesus probably was doing in the earth when he was there. First, he was completely conquering temptation, yet once again, now on our behalf, right? The temptation, sin, all of that. He was freeing, because anyone who be in him, we get freed from the captivity of hell by that act. Then, being freed now he has been redeemed. God sends him into the prison to minister to those who had died before he came. And he begins to take over there too. God now giving him mercy, giving all of them into his hand. That includes Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, all these guys, patriarchs, all the judges, Samson, Jephthah, Barak, all of them, Deborah, you name it. Rahab, all of them. Jesus is ministering to them in prison, right? And they're all listening to him and they're all following him while they're there. And just like it was in Joseph, right? And the keeper of the prison did not look unto anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So, now, in the prison, I'm going to go through one more piece of this, and then I'm actually going to pick up Joseph on my next episode, because his life is just extraordinarily rich with prophetic implication. If you follow it all the way through. Right now, we're at the part where Jesus is in the earth, right? And Joseph is in the earth. But we'll see that he's going to come up out of the earth in not too long. And the Shamgar, don't forget the Shamgar. What's the Shamgar? Pamela and Elle from Rice? I don't know what the Shamgar is. I'm going to have to pick that up from them, and I'll bring in the Shamgar tomorrow. Whatever that is. I don't know what that is. Okay, so then Joseph has a dream. So actually what happens, he's now in there, and Joseph is running the prison, right? And then it goes and it says, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody into the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. Right? Now, who was this baker and the butler? Right? Who was the baker and the butler? Now, I had been thinking about this, who they might be that were in this prison. The baker and the butler. And I actually started thinking maybe these were the two criminals on the cross. Right? The two criminals on the cross, and this is now after they had died with Jesus. They're down in the prison. They got tossed into the prison. Right? One of them, it says, he would be with me in paradise and would live because of Jesus. And the other, of course, wouldn't make it or be killed. So I thought that they kind of mapped pretty closely to those two. So we kind of see what happened to them after they got under the earth as well. Right? The butler and the baker and the king of the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt were confined in the prison, and each of them had a dream. Both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were very sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of the Lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they told him basically that they had had these dreams. And and Joseph said to them, "This is the interpretation of it." He said, "We each have a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." So Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me, please, what they are." And then the chief butler told him his dream to Joseph, and he said, "Behold, in my dream, a vine was before me, and in the vine there were 3 branches, and it was as though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, 'This is the interpretation of it.'" So God gave Joseph the interpretation on the spot. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now, interesting, isn't that? Remember what I said about the number 3? Right? The 3 branches are 3 days. Right? 3, 3, 3. Completeness, triunity, doneness. Right? Now within 3 days, and also notice that it was 3 days that Jesus was in the earth. Right? Within 3 days, so there was representing spiritually what might be going on now with these 3. 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. Right? But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me, make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. Right? Now remember what the criminal on the cross said to Jesus. "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Now you hear Joseph almost just echoing that terminology even, saying, "Look, I'm setting you free. Remember me, right? When you come and you're free. Remember me to deliver me from this place." Right? I thought that was pretty interesting. So, "For indeed, I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into this dungeon. I am innocent," Joseph said, as he represents the Messiah, Jesus. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, "I also had my dream. And there were 3 white baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket were all the kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head." So Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you." So he got a bad report, right? Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday. I don't know what significance that has, but it sounds interesting, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And so Joseph stayed in prison for a couple more years before he was actually redeemed. So I'm going to break it right there. I'm going to pick up tomorrow with the rest of Joseph's story, and we'll hopefully get to the end of his life, where I think that the parallels are just absolutely uncanny. And if you follow those parallels, you will land with me on where we are today in this story. If Joseph truly represents the life of Jesus from his beginning to his conclusion, and right now he's only representing the time that is leading up to, and I haven't even finished because we haven't gotten to his resurrection yet, right? So the time that Jesus was resurrected, and then what happens after his resurrection, all of that is written about in the life of Joseph, right? It can tell us what's going to happen in the not too distant future, right? So hang with me, tune in for my next one, and we'll finish this thing up. Thank you so much for joining me. God bless you. Bye.